Hello music makers, welcome back. On the last live stream, yes, live stream, if you didn't know, I stream live every month on the last Sunday at 6 p.m. GMT. I mentioned an iconic house track from an old video game of my childhood. Well, I thought it was iconic, but I was shocked, even appalled, at how many of you didn't seem to be aware of it. So, if you'll allow me, I'd like to talk you through this fascinating track, which essentially became my gateway drug into house music. Let's go! So here's a track in question, or my little recreation of it anyway. Isn't that just incredible? We've got so much to talk about. FM synthesis, stabs, rave chords, and lasers.
Hit me with those laser beams.
All the hallmarks of a good dance track. It's called Go Straight, and it's from the 1992 game Streets of Rage 2 on the Sega Mega Drive, or Genesis for those of you across the pond. It was made by Yuzo Koshiro and Motohiro Kawashima. It's in B-flat or A-sharp minor, most of the time, at least. We'll get to that. And the tempo is 128.4-ish beats per minute. We'll come to why that is later. Now, if you haven't heard of that track, then first of all, I'm truly sorry. Secondly, you're not alone. Last year, I watched jazz expert and fellow YouTuber Charles Cornell discover this for the first time. He had this to say.
Flat minor. Now, that in and of itself, it's a really interesting series of chords that I don't know where I've ever heard anything like that before.
By the way, if you think I'm fast at working out melodies, go see that guy. He's incredible. Anyway, it's interesting to hear a musician of his caliber say he's not heard that chord progression before. Because myself, as a musician that has since crossed over into the dance world, I can point you to several tracks which have used this kind of progression from dance music history, which were clearly influences for this track. We have tracks from 1992 itself, like Bass Value's Do You Want to Party? Or Rat Pack's Searching for My Rizzler. But I think the originator is probably 1989's Inner City's Good Life. That's actually mostly the same chord progression. And also 1989, the classic Landlord's I Like It. Also the same chord progression. Now, there's an interesting reason why all these tracks have a similar vibe. Let's discuss technology. Okay, so what's the big deal? Some Japanese video game composers were heavily influenced by Western dance music and put that vibe in their game. What's special about that? Well, this is 1992. Back then, video game music usually sounded like, well, video game music. Usually emulating other film soundtracks, or pop or rock. Club music was very new on the scene. However, it wasn't just that they were ahead of their time, it's the hardware they were working with. I'm sure many of you are familiar with a phrase something like, limitation breeds innovation. Well, this might be one of the best examples out there. You see, there was no MIDI, there was no DAWs, there was no sequencing, no drum machines or traditional synths like Roland Junos or 303s, and of course, no plugins. There was just this, or more specifically, this little fella. This paltry sound chip inside the Mega Drive, the Yamaha 2612, has some severe limitations when it comes to mimicking electronic dance music. First of which, you couldn't write lines by drawing in MIDI notes like we know in a DAW today. Things had to be coded like a computer program. Also, there were only 6 tracks on this thing. And to make things worse, none of those could play chords. They could only play one note at once. So if you wanted to make a chord made up of 3 notes, you had to use up 3 of those 6 tracks. Each of those 6 tracks contained a very basic FM synth, which doesn't sound too bad, does it? But the biggest limitation by far was no audio tracks. Technically, track 6 could hold samples, but what you have to remember is games at the time came on little cartridges, which had tiny amounts of memory, and that cartridge had to store the whole game. If there was any room for audio samples, it had to be extremely low quality, extremely short, and it was usually used for the odd voice sample. At today's qualities, you couldn't even fit a single kick drum on one of those cartridges, never mind a video game. In fact, they were so desperate for memory, one clever solution they came up with was to record the samples extremely pitched up and fast, therefore it was shorter. Then in the game, play them back at a much lower pitch, so it was nearer the original length. Albeit terrible sounding.
Like this.
All the sample memory on this game was used up for the voices, the sound effects like the punches and kicks, and the only musical element, as far as I can tell, is a 909 snare drum. So that's what we're working with. How on earth do you make a house rave banger with those chord limitations and no sampling? Okay, let's talk about chords. One of the most fascinating things about this track for me is why they chose these chords. And it's probably why a musician like Charles hasn't heard this kind of chord progression before. It all comes down to sampling. Because they didn't have the ability to sample, which when you think about it is the cornerstone of early house, especially sampled chord stabs. Because they couldn't sample, they had to write the chords in a way that emulates what happens when you sample chords. Let me show you what I mean. Okay, take this riff for example. It's in A minor, nice and easy, all the white notes. And if you were to ask a typical musician like myself to put chords on this, you start something like this with the typical 3-note chords. Do the same with these. Make sure everything's in the scale, move everything to the nearest white note. So there we go, that's all 4 chords, all within the scale of A minor. However, if I was to sample one of these chords, let's take the first one. I have a track ready here that's already set up to record the sound back in, so let's do that. Okay, good. So we've got that chord as audio now. Let's drop our audio into a sampler. Now let's have it play back that same riff we started with. We just want those initial single notes because remember we sampled a chord, so now one note triggers a whole chord. An interesting thing happens. This is not quite the same. Can you hear that? Let me show you what's happened. So here we've got all 7 notes of A minor. A, B, C, D, E, F, G. Like I said, all the white notes. If I was to build a chord on the first one, that looks like this. Now, if I just take this chord shape and copy it across, but start from note 2, you'll notice this note up here is no longer on the white notes. This would be out of scale, not in A minor. The correct chord for A minor, starting on note 2, would be this. So chord 2 in minor is actually a different shape to chord 1. Now look what happens if we try to copy that shape onto note 3. Again, this shape does not work in the scale. The correct shape for a chord in a minor scale, starting on note 3, is this one. So yet another different shape. Now, the chord 1 shape does work for chord 4. As you can see, it falls on all the white notes. And it also works for chord 5. All the white notes. But this shape does not work for chords 6 or 7. As you can see, we have notes falling outside of the scale again. They should be there and there. So when we write a track, we typically write everything within a given scale. That's the normal thing, right? Major, minor, all of our chords, melodies, so everything works together, we keep to a scale. However, when you sample a chord, the type of chord you sampled, in our case, the first chord was A minor, that shape is now fixed. No matter what note you now trigger that sample from, you're going to trigger a minor chord shape. But as we saw, not all chords in the scale are the same shape. So sometimes when you trigger that sample, you're going to trigger a chord which is out of scale, as we saw, anytime you press notes 2, 3, 6, or 7. So now let me show you in the MIDI what's really going on when you trigger the sample. Our chord 7 here, it's not this shape, it's this one. It's a minor shape. That's the key difference. Some chords are going to fall out of scale when you trigger them as samples. Now let's look at the original parts in the game. Okay, so I've done this by ear. This is roughly the way they arranged it. Disclaimer though, I have ignored channel restrictions. There's more than 6 tracks playing here. There is in the original 2. They used some clever tricks to make more than 6 tracks play back, but it's all a bit beyond the scope of this video. Everything else is accurate to the hardware though. So, as we can see, each part is one note only. Here's the first part of the main chord riff. That's the root notes of the chord, the lowest notes. Here are the second notes in the chord. As you can see, this is one of the notes that falls out of scale. Oh, by the way, everything in the original is A sharp minor, as I mentioned at the beginning. But here I've pulled everything down one, so it's in A minor. So it's easier to look at, judge everything against the white notes, etc. Here's the third note of the chord. And then there's a fourth part on top of all that. That's basically a melody part on top of the chord stack. I'm going to talk about that later. Here's what they all sound like. Now, on the original, you can hear a kind of echo effect. But this chip in the Mega Drive didn't have the ability to produce any effects at all. No delays, no reverbs, nothing. We'll talk about that in the next section. No, what they had to do to produce an echo effect back then is use another channel to play the same sound, but slightly quieter and slightly behind in time. So we have 2 of the same here. This one is just doing the echo. You can see I've just copied the channels and moved them slightly back in time. So that's the main riff. Let's talk about some of the other parts. There's a bass part. That bass part essentially stays on the 1 for the entire time, regardless of the chord movements. FYI, when the bass doesn't move, but the chords do, that's known in music as something called pedal bass. There's a kind of drone stab note here. That pans left and right. That's just holding note 1 again. Another pedal bass part. We have lasers. By the way, it turns out if you want a laser sound, all you have to do is run down lots of notes very, very fast. That sounds like it's done on a square wave. Now, there was another chip inside the Mega Drive which could just produce square waves, so I don't think this was done on the main chip. That swaps to this sound. Which is just the notes of an A minor chord, again, moving down very, very fast. And up and down in volume. Here are some drums. I've cheated here, I'm just using Ableton's 909 with a bit crusher on, because programming that in FM would be a nightmare. Like I said, I think the snare drum was sampled though. I have made a kind of FM hi-hat though here. I couldn't get quite as harsh as the original though. And then lastly, there's this stab chord. So that's everything in the intro arrangement. Now I want to talk about the top notes of this riff. What you might call the melody side of things. Let me select all these so we can see the whole chord. And you can see there, they are basically an octave above the bass note, the fundamental note. Until here. Here it deviates. The bass doesn't move, the bass stays on note 7, whereas the melody dips. It does the same over here as well. The bass stays on note 4, but the melody dips here. Now, this top line isn't them emulating sampled chords anymore. That was the first 3 notes. What's going on here is a bit of jazzification. Even if they're emulating Western styles, Japanese video game composers are known for bringing their inherent jazz influences into whatever they do. So if the bottom 3 notes are supposed to be the sampled chord stab, this top line is very much the Japanese touch on top. So as you can see, for the most part, we have those fixed shapes. These are all the same shape if I copy them around. This is the same as this. Same here. Same shape here. So emulating what happens when we sample chords until we get here. You can see the intention here. This is moving down and connecting these notes. I talked about this in the Garage Chords video. It's called chromatic voice leading. Sounds fancy, but it just means leaving the scale to make connecting melody lines. It's basically an inner melody inside the chords. So we've left the scale. As you can see, this is an F sharp, not a white note. So temporarily leaving the scale as a passing note to get to here. Very jazz. Also very similar to what I discussed in the Crystal Waters video. This one on the chord 4 isn't passing to anything, it's just melodic variation. A small amount of you might be wondering, what chord does that make then? Well, as we know, it's a minor chord underneath, and this extension is a 7th, but a sharp one, which makes it a major 7th. So the name for these chords is minor major 7th.
Kind of hideous.
Too jazzy?
Yeah, too jazzy.
Okay, let's look at some FM synthesis. I have done a video on synthesis types if you want to know the differences. Check that out. Meanwhile, here I'll be specifically focusing on the limitations of the Yamaha chip. To represent the 2612, conveniently the free version of Exact by Sonic Bits, this synth has a lot of the same limitations. If you're an Ableton user, you can just use the built-in operator synth, which is practically the same thing. But I'm going to use this synth so everyone can follow along. Speaking of limitations, what are they? Well, see this section over here? Sine, saw, square, triangle. There's also some basic sine variants in there. Well, you can forget all of that. The Yamaha had none of it. Not only did the original chip not have wavetables or anything fancy like that, it literally only has sine waves to offer. 4 of them, in fact, which is even less than the original FM synth the DX7 launched with 6 years earlier in 1983. So just 4 sine waves, no filter, so we'll be ignoring this section over here. This section is the same, the algorithm. This just means how the sine waves are routed into one another. And we have envelopes. Each sine wave has its own envelope, and that's everything we have to work with. So you've already heard the synth and what its limitations are, but I thought it would be interesting to show you how the sounds are actually made. Let's have a quick play around. Here's our default sine wave output. So what you're hearing is just oscillator, or should I say operator A, single sine wave. You can see up here on the algorithm, A has the arrow coming out, so that's the only output we can hear. This is our default routing. So B feeds into A, C feeds into B, which feeds into A, and D feeds into C, which feeds into B, which feeds into A. So even though we are only listening to A, if I start to turn up B, you're going to start to hear the results of it interacting with A. Like that. So that's B into A. Now if I turn up C, you'll hear C go through B, go through A. Remember, these are all just sine waves, although you're not hearing individual sine waves anymore. Because we're listening to the output of A, you're hearing all of the results of each one interacting, frequency modulating each other. And if I turn up D, you're now going to hear D feed C, which is feeding B, which is feeding A. As you can hear, far, far from a sine wave now. But it's not just levels we can play with. There's also pitch. This ratio control is a ratio compared to standard pitch. So a ratio of 2 to 1 means that would be an octave above the original, twice the frequency. That's an octave. So let's leave A at 1, ratio 1, standard pitch. And change B to a ratio of 2, so it's 1 octave up. And we can play around with C or D, changing different octaves at different points in the signal chain. And if you're wondering, yes, FM is very much trial and error. Unless you've played with FM for many, many years, it's very hard to predict the results of all this. So that's just messing with levels and octaves, but we also have envelopes. Each operator has its own envelope, which basically controls the level over time. So if I set B to ramp down over time, a few hundred milliseconds it says here, B's influence on A is going to decrease over time, but not just B, whatever was feeding B. So in our case, C and D as well. I've not touched A, that's still full volume at full duration. We could play around with the attack. So as you're beginning to see, there's quite a range of tones available. They often used the decay and attack of the subsequent operators to mimic what a filter sounds like. So even with just a basic FM synth like this one, you can see there's plenty of potential. It's just not very fast or easy. And also, don't forget, they weren't tweaking knobs or graphic envelopes on a nice user interface like this synthesizer here. It was all done typing numbers as code. And you couldn't hear the results instantly. You had to write the whole game to the cartridge and then run it to see if it worked. Seriously, video game composers back then were a different breed. Absolute heroes. Speaking of spending a lot of time fiddling with settings, it is possible to get some very useful results out of FM, including one very famous sound and a track that influenced Streets of Rage. It's Landlord. The Landlord stab is iconic to dance music, but it's been an elusive one because it's not an obvious piano sound or synth sound, and there's been a lot of debate over the years as to where it came from. However, after browsing the Gearspace forums, someone claims to have found that it is a sample of a synth patch, an FM synth, in fact. When I heard that news, I got busy experimenting with FM, and I came up with this. Not too bad. It's probably the closest I've ever gotten to making that sound. I used to think it was possibly a heavily pitched up guitar or something, but no, this is actually quite close. As you can see, just 3 sine waves, frequency modulated from one another. We're only hearing this top one. is being frequency modulated from number 2, which is being frequency modulated from number 3. So 3 oscillators, 3 operators, if you will. I have added some white noise and I am using the filter, so this would not be possible on the Mega Drive. But I thought it was an interesting aside to show how closely related it turns out the Landlord Stab is to Streets of Rage. Oh, and just to show you how fickle the nature is of FM in terms of each thing interacting with one another, if I just slightly change one of these settings, it completely changes the sound. So in other words, I had to fluke landing on these pretty much exact ratios for it to get near the Landlord sound. Anything else was completely off. And yes, if you're wondering, it did take a long time. And yes, I have saved the preset. Link down below. Hey, look what I just found. I was looking at the wiki page for the Yamaha 2612, and even though this chip was used in several devices, look who is credited as a prominent figure. Okie dokie. Well, I hoped you learned something. I certainly did. If you found this helpful in any way, press one of those buttons that helps me out, would you? Or if you're feeling extra generous, there's a link in the description to buy me a coffee. And until next week, I will see you down there in the comments. Bye-bye.